My name is Vera. I am 34 years old, and I want to tell you about the Sunday afternoon in October when my brother Nate sat down at my mother's kitchen table and said the truest thing he had ever said in his adult life, and how everything shifted because of it, and how I sat there and watched my mother's face change in a way I had been waiting to see for longer than I can remember. But first I have to tell you about the 15 years before that, because you need to understand what was built and how it was built and how long it took before anyone decided to look at what we'd all been living inside. When I was 7 years old, I broke a lamp. I want to start there, with the lamp, because the lamp is where it begins, not literally, maybe because I'm sure the pattern existed before I was old enough to register it, but the lamp is the first clear memory I have of it. The first time I understood, in whatever fragmentary way a 7-year-old understands things, that something was happening in our house that wasn't quite fair. The lamp was in the living room. It was a tall floor lamp, cream-colored shade, the kind my mother kept in the corner near the bookshelf because the overhead light in that room was too harsh. I had not broken it on purpose. I was running from what, I don't remember, probably from nothing, probably just running the way 7-year-olds run because the energy in a body that age has to go somewhere. And I'd caught the base with my elbow and the whole thing went over and the shade cracked against the hardwood floor. My brother Nate was 5 at the time. He was sitting on the couch watching something on the television when it happened, had nothing to do with any of it, was not a participant in any meaningful sense of the word. He was 5 watching cartoons bothering no one. My mother came out of the kitchen at the sound of the crash. She looked at the lamp. She looked at me. She looked at Nate, who had pulled his knees to his chest on the couch with the expression of a child bracing for something loud. And she said to me, "You are 7 years old, Vera. You know better than to run in the house. And you should be watching out for your brother. What if that had hit him? What if he'd been standing right there?" He hadn't been standing right there. He was on the couch. He was fine. The lamp had fallen away from him entirely. But the thing that was established in that moment, the grammar of it, the logic that my mother was using, was this: I was the older one. I was responsible for the space. When something went wrong in that space, it was my failure first, my lapse in supervision, my should have known better. Even when the thing that went wrong had nothing to do with Nate. Even when Nate was fine. Even when he was across the room watching cartoons, not involved. I was 7. I filed it away without knowing I was filing it, went to my room and cried about the lamp for 20 minutes, and then forgot about it the way children forget things, the way things get buried under the next day and the next week and the whole ongoing project of growing up. But it didn't disappear. It just went underground. And underground it kept growing. My family was not, by external measure, a difficult one. We were not poor, not wealthy either, solidly middle class. My father Howard working in insurance sales for 30 years with the reliability of a clock. My mother Lorraine teaching 4th grade at an elementary school 3 miles from our house with a dedication that her students' parents found extraordinary and that I, as her daughter, sometimes found exhausting. We lived in a 2-story colonial in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and bring casseroles when someone has a baby or loses a parent. Where you know your neighbors by name, and where the elementary school is good and the summers smell like cut grass and chlorine from the community pool down the street. We were, by all appearances, fine. My father was a quiet man. Not cold. Howard was genuinely warm, actually, in the specific limited way of men of his generation who loved their families sincerely but didn't have much language for it. He showed love in actions rather than words. He came to every school play, every soccer game, every band concert. He drove us to practices without complaint, made pancakes on Sunday mornings in elaborate shapes, fixed things around the house with a competence that I found deeply reassuring as a child, this sense that when something broke, Howard would make it whole again. He was not an unfair man. I want to say that clearly. He was not the architect of what happened in our family. He was the person who watched it happen and did not intervene, which is its own kind of participation, but it was passive rather than designed. My mother was the one who designed it. Not consciously. I have to, because the alternative is harder to carry, that she did not sit down one day and decide to construct a system in which her elder child would be held responsible for the choices of her younger one. I believe it grew in her without her noticing, the way certain kinds of damage grow. Gradually in the dark, fed by things that were already there before you arrived. The thing that was already there was Nate himself. Nate came into the world 3 weeks early, with a heart murmur that required monitoring for the first 2 years of his life. I was too young to understand any of this at the time. I was 2 when he was born, barely old enough to know there was a new person in the house, but I have come to understand in the adult reconstruction you do when you are trying to make sense of your childhood, that those early years with Nate's heart established something in my mother that never fully unwound. A vigilance. A specific, pitched anxiety about his safety and well-being that never entirely returned to baseline even after the murmur was declared resolved, even after the cardiologist said he was fine, even after he grew into a perfectly healthy, physically robust child who would go on to play basketball through high school and never spend another day in a cardiologist's office. The fear had been installed in her. And once that kind of fear is installed, it reshapes how you love the person you were afraid for. It makes you hold them differently, guard them differently, see them differently. I am not saying my mother loved Nate more than she loved me. I genuinely don't believe that is the truth. I think she loved us equally and in completely different ways, and that one of those ways involved a protectiveness so deep it had become distorting, a need to keep Nate safe that extended somewhere along the line into a need to keep Nate from the consequences of his own choices, which extended into a need to locate those consequences somewhere else when they arose. And where do consequences go? When you redirect them away from the person who created them, they go to the nearest responsible party, which in our family was always me. I grew up being the responsible one in the way that some older children of anxious mothers grow up. Comprehensively, thoroughly, without much choice in the matter. By the time I was 10, I was the child my mother trusted with the details of our household, where the spare key was, what time Nate got out of school on early release days, what to do if something happened and she wasn't reachable. I did not resent this at 10. I was proud of it, actually, in the way children are proud of being needed. Felt like trust. Felt like recognition. What I did not understand then, what took me until my late 20s to fully articulate, was that the trust was not mutual. My mother trusted me to be responsible, but she did not extend me the mercy that should accompany responsibility. She held me accountable without protecting me. She expected me to be capable without crediting me for the capability. And when things went wrong, when Nate made a choice that led somewhere bad, when a situation arose that could be traced back to a decision he had made, she turned to me and said, in the language of our household, the language she'd been speaking since the lamp, "You should have known better. Let me give you the examples." I think I need to give you the examples because without them this sounds like a vague complaint about parental favoritism, and it was more specific than that. It was a sustained, repeated pattern across 15 years that I can walk through the way you walk through a house you know by heart. When I was 11 and Nate was 9, he broke the window in the garage trying to throw a tennis ball against it at the angle his friend had shown him would make it curve. My mother was at school. My father was at work. I was home doing homework at the kitchen table. I heard the glass break and I came out to find Nate looking at the broken window with his mouth open. And when my mother came home 2 hours later and asked what had happened, she listened to both of our explanations and then said to me, "Asterisk, you were here, Vera. You could have told him not to do that." Asterisk. I had not known he was doing it. When I was 13 and Nate was 11, he told his teacher that our mother had given permission for him to go to a classmate's house after school without telling anyone at home, which was a lie he had constructed entirely by himself to avoid having to ask permission. He got caught when my mother called the school about something unrelated, and the teacher mentioned it. At dinner that night, my mother said, "Asterisk, why didn't you tell me he was planning something after school?" Asterisk. I had not known he was planning anything after school. When I was 15 and Nate was 13, he started smoking. Cigarettes first, which is relevant only because it tells you something about the trajectory of what came after. He hid it badly. Kids always hide things badly. They don't understand yet that adults' noses work. And when my mother found the pack in his jacket pocket, she sat us both down in the living room and said to me, "Asterisk, you knew about this." Asterisk. It was not a question. I said I didn't. She said, "Asterisk, you're his older sister. You should have noticed." Asterisk. That word should, it did a lot of work in my childhood. Asterisk should have noticed. Should have stopped him. Should have said something. Should have been paying attention. Should have known. Asterisk. It stitched itself into the fabric of how I understood my position in our family. Not as a child, not as a person with her own inner life and limited field of vision, but as a supervisor. A keeper. A person responsible for a jurisdiction that included another person's choices and their outcomes. And the thing about being a supervisor is that you are not the same as the person you supervise. When the person you supervise does something wrong, the wrongness has a hierarchy. Nate made the choice. I failed to prevent the choice. In my mother's mathematics, these were different errors and mine was worse because I was the one who knew better. I want to tell you about Nate in those years because I need you to understand that he was not a villain in my childhood. He was a child and then an adolescent doing what children and adolescents do, testing limits, making impulsive decisions, lying to avoid consequences, trying to figure out who he was in the world. None of his choices in those years were catastrophic. The garage window, the unsupervised visit, the cigarettes, these were ordinary misbehaviors, the stuff of normal childhood, the kind of thing most families handle and move on from. The thing that was not ordinary was what happened afterward in our family. The way the fault was redistributed. The way Nate learned, not consciously, I'm almost certain not consciously, because he was a child and children absorbed the lessons around them without being able to name them, that when things went wrong, there was a mechanism in our household that redirected blame away from him. He did not design that mechanism. He didn't have to. It had been there before he understood it. But children learn the shape of the world they live in, and the shape of Nate's world included the fact that his choices had a partially insulated quality, that the heat of their consequences was managed by my mother's need to protect him and channeled, when necessary, onto me. I want to tell you about my father, Howard, because he matters here in a way that is quiet but real. Howard watched all of this happen and did not intervene. Not once, not in a meaningful way, over the entire 15 years that this pattern ran. He was present. He heard the conversations. He sat at the dinner tables and the kitchen counters where my mother said the things she said to me. And he would sometimes say quietly, "Lorraine, maybe," and my mother would look at him with the particular look that long-married people use to end sentences, and the sentence would end, and Howard would go back to his dinner. I do not hate my father for this. I have had to sit with that, the not hating, the understanding, because it would be easier in some ways to be furious at him. A passive participant is still a participant. A silence in the face of injustice is a kind of vote. I know all of this. And I also know Howard. I know that he was a man who had spent his whole life avoiding confrontation with the force that was my mother, who had learned the same lesson I had learned, that the cleanest way through a day was to not disturb the currents of the household. He was not brave. He was not an advocate for me. He was kind and well-meaning and fundamentally not up to the task of pushing back against my mother's anxiety-driven narrative, and that failure shaped my childhood as surely as anything she did directly. The smoking was the beginning of a longer story with Nate. I want to tell you that story because it is the spine of everything that comes later, and because the truth of it, the full truth, the truth that took 15 years to come out, is the unexpected thing in this story, the thing that reframes all of it, the thing that made me sit at my mother's kitchen table in October and feel the ground shift under me. Nate was bright. I want to establish that. He was genuinely, evidently, specifically bright, the kind of kid who could read a room, understand people, figure out what a situation required of him and produce it. He was funny in the quick, improvisational way that teachers loved in short doses and that parents of teenage boys spent a lot of time trying to redirect. He was popular in high school in the way that rests on charm rather than effort, the effortless social kind that looks easy from the outside and is probably more exhausting to maintain than it appears. He was also, from about the age of 16 onward, making choices that were quietly bad. Not jail bad. Not headline bad. But the kind of choices that a person with good judgment looks at and thinks, this is going to cost something. Drinking at parties before he had any framework for understanding his relationship with alcohol. Spending money he didn't have on things that couldn't wait. Getting into a car with a driver who'd been drinking twice, and by some mercy of the universe making it home both times. Disappearing from obligations, school assignments, family dinners, jobs he'd agreed to hold, without explanation, then returning with a story that was plausible enough to forestall deeper questioning. None of this was extreme. I want to keep saying that because it's true and because it matters. Nate was not, in those years, a person in crisis. He was a person who was getting away with things, and who had been learning to get away with things since he was old enough to figure out the mechanism, and who had never, as far as I can tell, been genuinely confronted with the full weight of his own choices. Because when the weight of his choices began to accumulate, my mother redistributed it. When I was 15 and Nate was 13, he started smoking. Cigarettes first, which is relevant only because it tells you something about the trajectory of what came after. He hid it badly. Kids always hide things badly. They don't understand yet that adults' noses work. And when my mother found the pack in his jacket pocket, she sat us both down in the living room and said to me, asterisk, you knew about this. Asterisk. It was not a question. I said I didn't. She said, asterisk, you're his older sister. You should have noticed. Asterisk. That word should, it did a lot of work in my childhood. Asterisk should have noticed. Should have stopped him. Should have said something. Should have been paying attention. Should have known, asterisk, it stitched itself into the fabric of how I understood my position in our family. Not as a child, not as a person with her own inner life and limited field of vision, but as a supervisor, a keeper, a person responsible for a jurisdiction that included another person's choices and their outcomes. And the thing about being a supervisor is that you are not the same as the person you supervise. When the person you supervise does something wrong, the wrongness has a hierarchy. Nate made the choice. I failed to prevent the choice. In my mother's mathematics, these were different errors and mine was worse because I was the one who knew better. I want to tell you about Nate in those years because I need you to understand that he was not a villain in my childhood. He was a child and then an adolescent doing what children and adolescents do, testing limits, making impulsive decisions, lying to avoid consequences, trying to figure out who he was in the world. None of his choices in those years were catastrophic. The garage window, the unsupervised visit, the cigarettes, these were ordinary misbehaviors, the stuff of normal childhood, the kind of thing most families handle and move on from. The thing that was not ordinary was what happened afterward in our family. The way the fault was redistributed. The way Nate learned, not consciously, I'm almost certain not consciously, because he was a child and children absorbed the lessons around them without being able to name them, that when things went wrong, there was a mechanism in our household that redirected blame away from him. He did not design that mechanism. He didn't have to. It had been there before he understood it. But children learn the shape of the world they live in, and the shape of Nate's world included the fact that his choices had a partially insulated quality, that the heat of their consequences was managed by my mother's need to protect him and channeled, when necessary, onto me. I want to tell you about my father, Howard, because he matters here in a way that is quiet but real. Howard watched all of this happen and did not intervene. Not once, not in a meaningful way, over the entire 15 years that this pattern ran. He was present. He heard the conversations. He sat at the dinner tables and the kitchen counters where my mother said the things she said to me. And he would sometimes say quietly, Lorraine, maybe. And my mother would look at him with the particular look that long-married people use to end sentences. And the sentence would end, and Howard would go back to his dinner. I do not hate my father for this. I have had to sit with that, the not hating, the understanding, because it would be easier in some ways to be furious at him. A passive participant is still a participant. A silence in the face of injustice is a kind of vote. I know all of this. And I also know Howard. I know that he was a man who had spent his whole life avoiding confrontation with the force that was my mother, who had learned the same lesson I had learned, that the cleanest way through a day was to not disturb the currents of the household. He was not brave. He was not an advocate for me. He was kind and well-meaning and fundamentally not up to the task of pushing back against my mother's anxiety-driven narrative, and that failure shaped my childhood as surely as anything she did directly. The smoking was the beginning of a longer story with Nate. I want to tell you that story because it is the spine of everything that comes later, and because the truth of it, the full truth, the truth that took 15 years to come out, is the unexpected thing in this story, the thing that reframes all of it, the thing that made me sit at my mother's kitchen table in October and feel the ground shift under me. Nate was bright. I want to establish that. He was genuinely, evidently, specifically bright, the kind of kid who could read a room, understand people, figure out what a situation required of him and produce it. He was funny in the quick, improvisational way that teachers loved in short doses and that parents of teenage boys spent a lot of time trying to redirect. He was popular in high school in the way that rests on charm rather than effort, the effortless social kind that looks easy from the outside and is probably more exhausting to maintain than it appears. He was also, from about the age of 16 onward, making choices that were quietly bad. Not jail bad. Not headline bad. But the kind of choices that a person with good judgment looks at and thinks, this is going to cost something. Drinking at parties before he had any framework for understanding his relationship with alcohol. Spending money he didn't have on things that couldn't wait. Getting into a car with a driver who'd been drinking twice, and by some mercy of the universe making it home both times. disappearing from obligations, school assignments, family dinners, jobs he'd agreed to hold, without explanation, then returning with a story that was plausible enough to forestall deeper questioning. None of this was extreme. I want to keep saying that because it's true and because it matters. Nate was not, in those years, a person in crisis. He was a person who was getting away with things, and who had been learning to get away with things since he was old enough to figure out the mechanism, and who had never, as far as I can tell, been genuinely confronted with the full weight of his own choices. Because when the weight of his choices began to accumulate, my mother redistributed it. I was 17 and Nate was 15 when he got caught shoplifting, a stupid thing, a hat from a sporting goods store, the kind of impulsive act that has no logic behind it except the invincibility that comes with being 15 and certain the world is not watching. The store called my mother. She came and collected him. And at home, after a conversation I was not part of but could hear the shape of through the wall of my bedroom, she came and found me in my room and said, "Asterisk, you were with him last Saturday at that mall. You should have seen what kind of mood he was in. You should have said something to me." Asterisk. I had not been with him the Saturday before. I had been at a friend's house. I told her this. She said, asterisk, "You knew he was hanging around with those kids." Asterisk. I said, asterisk, "Mom, I can't watch everything he does." Asterisk. She said, asterisk, "He's 15, Vera. You're 17. You understand things he doesn't yet. That's what being older means." Asterisk. I sat with that for a long time after she left my room. I sat with the strange specific logic of it, that my age was a liability, that understanding more meant being responsible for more, that growing up faster, seeing more clearly, being further along somehow meant that I was more culpable for whatever happened to my brother, because I could have known and should have known and did know somewhere even when I hadn't and I didn't. I started around this time doing something I am not proud of. I started pulling back. Not from Nate, not from loving him, not from being his sister, not from the ordinary daily proximity of sharing a house and a family, but from the parts that came with risk. I started not asking what he was doing on weekends. I started not noticing the things I might have noticed if I'd been paying the attention my mother thought I was paying, because I had discovered, through the accumulation of those years, that paying attention and noticing things only gave my mother more material. If I noticed something worrying about Nate and said something, I was interfering, overstepping, adding drama. If I noticed something worrying about Nate and said nothing, I should have said something. And if something subsequently went wrong, I should have noticed and said something. There was no version in which I was simply a person who didn't know everything her brother was doing. There was no version in which his choices were only his. So I built a wall of deliberate not knowing, because deliberate not knowing, I had calculated, was the only available defense. I am not saying this was right. I am saying it was 17 years old and doing the math with what it had. I left for college at Ohio State when I was 18, and it was the first full breath I had taken in years, though I didn't know at the time that's what it was. I just knew that I arrived on a campus 3 hours from my family home and felt, for the first time in my memory, that I was not the edge of a circuit, that the current was not running through me, that nothing I did or failed to do was going to result in someone telling me I should have known better. It was extraordinary. It was the ordinary freedom of being 18 and away from home, which is what it was supposed to be, but I felt it more acutely than I had any framework to understand. I called home on Sundays. My mother gave me updates about Nate with the regularity of someone filing reports, a habit I only later recognized as its own kind of training, keeping me tethered to the jurisdiction even when I was supposed to be outside it. Nate was fine in those years. A little rough around the edges. He was 15, then 16, then 17, but fine. He made the basketball team. He had a girlfriend my mother adored. He pulled his grades up in junior year after some difficult months. I heard these reports with a specific feeling of someone who is being updated about a place they used to live, a careful combination of interest and distance. I was studying communications because I genuinely loved the theory of how people transmit meaning to each other, how signals get sent and received and garbled and reconstructed, how what we intend to say and what other people hear can be two entirely different things. I found in those courses language for things I had been experiencing my whole life without being able to name them. I took a class my junior year on family communication dynamics that I sat through with the persistent sensation of being described, of having someone diagram the system I had grown up inside without knowing it had a diagram. The professor, a woman named Dr. Osei, who wore the kind of cardigans that suggested she had opinions about everything and was right about most of them, Said something in one of those lectures that I wrote down in my notebook and have not forgotten. Asterisk, the most invisible forms of control in family systems are the ones that have been normalized long enough to feel like love. Asterisk. I wrote it down. I looked at it for a long time. I did not call my mother. I graduated in 4 years, moved back to Columbus for a job at a communications firm downtown, and moved into an apartment with my college friend Delia, who was from a large Italian family in Cincinnati, and who had the particular energy of someone raised with too many people in too small a space, loud, generous, perpetually feeding people, constitutionally unable to be in a room without checking if everyone was okay. I loved her with the love you develop for people who are different from you in every way that matters and the same in every way that counts. And I came back to the orbit of my family. Nate was 19 by then, a year out of high school, having decided not to go to college after a series of conversations with my parents that I was not party to, having instead started working for a friend's landscaping company while he figured out what he wanted to do. He was living at home still. He was, according to my mother's Sunday reports, finding his way. This was her phrase, finding his way. I heard it so often over those years that it stopped sounding like a description of a process and started sounding like a prayer, a thing she said to keep something at bay. I had been back in Columbus for 3 months when I had the first dinner that set the template for the next 12 years of family dinners. This was the Thanksgiving when Nate arrived 2 hours late to my parents' house, which my mother had full of people, aunts, my father's brother Frank and his wife Connie, cousins, and announced that he'd gotten a DUI the previous weekend, which he hadn't mentioned to anyone, and that he needed to borrow money to pay the fine. He delivered this information in the same casual, matter-of-fact way he delivered everything, the way that had always made his disclosures land harder because they were so dissonant with their own content, so light in tone about such heavy things. My mother absorbed this at the dinner table in a way I recognized from 20 years of watching her. A brief stillness, a composure that settled over her features like a mask going on, and then a pivot. Not to Nate. To me. She looked at me and she said, "Asterisk, did you know about this?" Asterisk. I said no. She said, "Asterisk, he didn't say anything to you?" Asterisk. I said no. She said, and this one I remember with specific, complete clarity, as if it were happening right now, Asterisk, Vera, you've been back for 3 months. He's your brother. He lives 10 minutes from you. Asterisk. The implication was, Asterisk, you should have known. You should have been watching. You should have been in his life in a way that would have either prevented this or at least informed you of it. And the fact that you were not means this is also somehow yours. Asterisk. Frank and Connie were looking at their plates. Howard was looking at the turkey. Nate was helping himself to stuffing with the air of someone who had successfully handed something off and was now free to eat. And I sat there, 22 years old, 3 months back, 3 months into what I'd hoped was a new chapter, and felt the old grammar click back into place around me like a set of walls I'd forgotten were there. I should have known better. Here is where the story enters its long middle section, the section that is 12 years long, that takes place between my coming home at 22 and the October Sunday when I was 34. I am going to tell you this middle section honestly, which means I am going to tell you things that show how I participated in my own situation even as I was suffering from it, how I kept showing up to tables that hurt me, how I maintained the fiction of a family that operated normally right up until I couldn't anymore. I tell you this not to be hard on myself, I have been hard enough on myself, but because I think the honest version of this story is more useful than the flattering one. Nate's 20s were a decade of choices that generated consequences that my mother then managed by distributing the weight of them onto me. Some of these choices were financial. Nate had a gift for ambitious projects with insufficient foundations. He started a landscaping business of his own at 24, borrowed money from our parents to fund it, ran it for a year and a half with genuine skill and charm, and then ran it into the ground because the skill and charm were not matched by the organizational capacity to manage accounts, payroll, and client relationships simultaneously. When the business failed, my parents absorbed the debt. When my mother needed to explain why the debt existed and why it hadn't been predicted, she said to me, at a Sunday dinner 3 months after the collapse, Asterisk, you work in communications. You understand business. You could have looked at his plan and seen the problems. Asterisk. I had not seen his business plan. I had not been invited to look at his business plan. He was 24 years old and it was his business. Some of his choices were relational. He dated a woman named Paige from the time he was 22 until he was 26. A 4-year relationship that my mother loved and everyone in the family was waiting on, in the way families wait on the relationships of young men who seem like they are heading somewhere, with the implicit assumption that the relationship was a sign of that heading somewhere-ness. When Nate and Paige broke up, he broke up with her, I later found out, not the other way. My mother called me the same night and said, "Asterisk, did you say something to him? Did you make him feel like she wasn't right for him?" Asterisk. I had said nothing to him. I had liked Paige enormously. The only opinion I had offered about his relationship once over a year earlier when he had asked me directly was that she seemed wonderful and he seemed happy, and that seemed like enough. My mother, on some level I have never fully understood, had decided that my one expression of approval had been the thing that made Nate take the relationship seriously, and that therefore my insufficient follow-through advocacy was responsible for its end. I did not say this out loud. I said, "Asterisk, Mom, Nate made his own decision." Asterisk. She said, "Asterisk, he listens to you, Vera." Asterisk. He did not actually listen to me. This is the thing, this is the cruelest irony of the whole system. Nate and I were not close in those years. How could we be? I had spent our entire adolescence pulling back from him, protecting myself from the mechanism by limiting my exposure to its inputs. We had a polite, familial relationship, phone calls on birthdays, attendance at the same family dinners, the kind of sibling relationship that exists in the calendar and the holidays and not much in between. I did not know who his close friends were. I did not know what he worried about at night. I did not know, in the deep and textured way of actual closeness, who my brother was. And my mother had constructed a narrative in which I was deeply involved in his life, in which my influence was constant and significant, in which I was both failing to prevent his bad choices and somehow the cause of them, which is a logical impossibility that I never figured out how to address because you can't logic your way out of a feeling someone has decided to have about you. I was through all of this building my own life. I want to make sure I tell you that, because this story is not only the story of what was done to me. I was living. I got better at my job. I moved from the communications firm to a nonprofit that did public health advocacy work, writing and producing materials about mental health literacy, which is a field I landed in by accident and stayed in because it turned out to be a field that was writing about me as much as I was writing about it. I had friendships that were deep and sustaining. Delia and I eventually stopped being roommates but stayed the kind of friends who talk every day and show up when things are bad. I had a relationship from 25 to 28 that was serious and good and ended. When it ended in the honest, mutual grown-up way that some things end without cruelty or drama, just a recognition that two people had reached the edge of what they were to each other. I was, in other words, a person. A full one. With a life that had weight and texture and meaning. I want to make sure you know that, because the story of what was happening at my parents' dining room table is not the whole of what was happening in the world I was actually living in. But it was in the background of everything. Always. The way a sound can be in the background of everything. Not always audible, not always intrusive, but there, and the moments when you notice it remind you it has always been there and will always be there until something changes. The something changes part is coming. But I need to tell you a few more things first because they matter. The first thing I need to tell you is about the drinking. Nate's relationship with alcohol, which had started with the DUI at 19, which my mother had never fully confronted, because to confront it fully would have meant sitting with the fact that she had not prevented it and had redistributed its weight instead of addressing it. His relationship with alcohol got worse in his mid to late 20s. Quietly at first, the way these things usually go. He drank more than other people at family dinners and laughed it off as good cheer. He showed up to things smelling of it sometimes, not drunk, just present with it. He missed my father's 65th birthday party because he said he wasn't feeling well, and my mother told me, 2 weeks later, that he'd actually spent that day dealing with a hangover so severe he hadn't been able to get out of bed. She told me this and then said, "Asterisk, he's been struggling, Vera. Have you not noticed? Have you not been spending time with him?" Asterisk. And here is where I want to be honest about my own failures. I did not say what I should have said. I did not say, "Mom, if you knew he was struggling and you have been watching this for years and you have said nothing directly to him about it, that is a choice you made, and it is not a choice I made because you have never let me be close enough to him to know what he needs." I did not say any of that. I said, "Asterisk, I've been calling him. He doesn't always pick up." Asterisk. She said, "Asterisk, he picks up for me." Asterisk. Of course he did. She didn't challenge him. She didn't say things he'd have to defend himself against. She was the soft landing always. I was the person he had been taught by watching how things worked in our family to maintain a certain distance from, because I was the one who noticed things, who tracked things, who couldn't be managed as easily as our mother could. I don't think Nate thought about it this consciously. I want to be fair to him. I think he had a relational instinct honed over 30 years, for who was safe and who required more caution, and that instinct had sorted me into the caution category without him ever having to examine why. The second thing I need to tell you about is the night I finally said something. It was a Sunday dinner in February, the February I was 31 and Nate was 29, and my father was there, and my mother and Nate's new girlfriend Becca, who was the first person he had dated seriously since Paige and who was already beloved by my mother with a fervor that I recognized as my mother's hope wearing the costume of affection. Becca was warm and quiet and looked at Nate with the specific look of someone who loves a person and is not quite sure they know who they're loving, which is a look I recognized because I had been watching the people in Nate's life look at him that way for years. Dinner was fine through the first 2 courses. And then Howard made an offhand remark about the landscaping company, the one that had failed 6 years earlier, in the context of something he'd read in the news about small businesses, and Nate said very casually that he'd been thinking about starting another one, that he'd learned from his mistakes, that he had a better sense now of what he'd need to do differently. My mother's face went through 3 things very quickly: hope, then anxiety, then the particular setting of features that meant she was going to say something she'd already decided. She turned to me and said, "Vera, you could help him with the business side. You understand these things." And I looked at her. I looked at her for a moment that was maybe 2 seconds longer than comfortable. And I said, Mom, I'm not going to be responsible for Nate's business. The table went quiet. She said, I wasn't asking you to be responsible. I was asking you to help. I said, the last time I was asked to help, and the time before that, and the time before that, what I was actually being asked to do was absorb blame if things went wrong. And I am 31 years old and I'm not doing that anymore. I had not planned to say this. It came out of me the way things sometimes do when you have been swallowing them for long enough that they develop their own force and the next available exit, and it was only afterward that I recognized the pressure that had been building toward that moment. My mother looked at me as if I had said something in a language she didn't speak. Howard said, Vera, in the tone of someone trying to prevent something. Nate said nothing. He was looking at the table. Becca was looking at her hands. My mother said, I don't know where that came from, but I think we should all take a breath. I said, it came from 31 years of dinners exactly like this one. And then I folded my napkin, set it on the table, excused myself and left. I drove home. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building for 40 minutes. Then I went upstairs and called Delia and told her everything, and she said, in the way only Delia can say things, Vera, baby, you have been carrying a piano for 31 years and you just set it down for 30 seconds and your family looked at you like you were the one being unreasonable. Do you hear me? Do you hear how that sounds? I heard her. I cried. I did not call my parents that night. My mother texted me 2 days later a text that said, I know things have been hard, Vera. I hope you're okay. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement of anything specific. An expression of hope that the disturbance had smoothed over, which is the closest my mother had ever come to addressing anything directly. I went to 2 more Sunday dinners that year. Then I started going every other week. Then once a month. I was not cutting off my family. I want to be clear about that because this is not a story about cutting people off, which I think is often the right choice and I would not judge anyone for making it. This is a story about a slower renegotiation, a gradual reduction of exposure, a person trying to figure out how to stay connected to people she loved without being harmed by the system those people operated inside. I also, around this time, started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Petrov. She was a small, Russian-born woman in her 50s with an office full of plants and the particular quality of stillness that I have come to associate with very good therapists, the kind of stillness that says I am completely here and I will not be disturbed by what you say. I had been thinking about therapy for years in the abstract way you think about things you know you should do, and what finally got me there was a simple and embarrassing calculation. I had spent approximately 2 decades being blamed for things that were not my fault, and I was beginning to believe it, and I needed someone to help me stop. Dr. Petrov was excellent. She did not tell me what to feel. She did not tell me my mother was a narcissist or that my family was toxic or any of the flattening language that the internet loves for these situations. What she did was help me build a map of my own history, the lamp and the garage window and the shoplifting and the DUI and the failed business and page and all of it, and look at it from a height so that the shape of it was visible in a way it hadn't been when I was inside it. She said, in one of our earlier sessions, *, you have been operating inside a system that assigned you a role before you were old enough to consent to it, and you've been trying to perform that role perfectly ever since, even when performing it perfectly was impossible because the role itself was impossible. That is exhausting and it is not your failure. *. I said, *, then whose failure is it? *. She said, *, I think that's the question your family has been carefully not asking for 30 years. *. I sat with that. I was in therapy for the next 3 years, off and on, going more frequently in hard periods and less frequently when things were calmer. It did not fix anything about my family. Therapy never fixes anything about your family. What it did was give me a cleaner relationship with my own history, a way of holding the difficult things without being held by them, and language, precise, compassionate language, for things I had been experiencing without words. And it helped me see my brother more clearly. Here is what I came to understand about Nate, through the combination of therapy and time and the gradual accumulation of perspective that happens when you stop being in the middle of something and start being able to see its edges. Nate had been protected from his own choices for so long that he had not developed a genuine relationship with them. He was 30, then 31, then 32, and he was still operating with the instinct of someone for whom consequences were not fully real, who could make a choice, watch it produce fallout, and trust that the fallout would be managed. Not because he was a bad person. I want to be very, very clear about this. Nate was not a bad person. He was a person who had been stunted in a specific and painful way, whose development in the area of accountability had been interfered with at every stage by a mother who loved him more than she was capable of letting him fail, and who had learned from that interference that the world was more forgiving than it actually was. The drinking had gotten worse. Becca left him at 29. Not because she didn't love him but because she had realized, in the way observant people eventually realize things, that she was signing up for a life of managing someone who could not manage himself, and that love was not enough to make that sustainable. When she left, Nate didn't fall apart. He shrugged in the way he had always shrugged, and within 3 months he was seeing someone else, a woman named Ren who worked at a bar, and who I met once at a family dinner and liked immediately and worried about immediately, because Ren had the quality of someone who found chaos interesting, which is fine until the chaos is the person sitting across from you at breakfast. My mother called me the week after Becca left and said, *, did you know she was going to leave? *. I said no. She said, *, I wonder if she felt unwelcome. Did you ever make her feel welcome, Vera? *. I hung up the phone and sat on my bathroom floor for 15 minutes. I am telling you this specific moment, the bathroom floor 15 minutes, because I want you to understand where I was internally by the time the October Sunday came around. I was not in crisis. I was not falling apart. I was a 34-year-old woman with a job she loved and friendships that sustained her and a therapist she trusted and a life that was, by any reasonable external measure, good. But I was also a woman who had been a thing being shaped by hands other than her own for 34 years, who had a bathroom floor she knew the temperature of in the specific way you know the temperature of the places you go to be alone with hard feelings. I was tired. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just in the bone-quiet way of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time. Now I need to tell you about the dark thing. The thing that I did not know the full truth of until Nate sat down at my mother's kitchen table in October and said it out loud. The thing that, when I look back at the shape of the 15 years, explains certain things I had always been confused by. Why my mother's responses to Nate's failures had a quality of panic underneath them that went beyond ordinary parental worry. Why her need to protect him had an urgency that seemed disproportionate. Why Howard had been not just conflict avoidant but specifically, pointedly avoidant of certain topics when they arose. When Nate was 17, this is the year I was 19, the year I was in my first year of college, the year I was 3 hours away doing the project of becoming myself in the ordinary way of college students, Nate overdosed. I did not know this. For 15 years I did not know this. It was not a large overdose. It was not a dramatic event in the emergency room sense. He did not stop breathing. He did not require resuscitation. He did not have a near-death experience in any cinematic form. He had taken pills. I don't know exactly what. Nate eventually told me the specifics and they don't belong in this retelling. At a party in a combination and quantity that made him sick enough that his friend drove him to the hospital in a panic, where he was treated, monitored, and released to my parents in the middle of the night. My parents brought him home, and then they never spoke of it again. Not to extended family, not to friends, not to me, not to Nate in any real sense. I believe they took him to a therapist once briefly, and then stopped because Nate said he was fine and because my mother needed him to be fine, needed it with the specific shaking urgency of a woman whose child had nearly been taken from her in the same terrifying way his heart had nearly been taken from her when he was 2 years old. And so fine was what he became, at least on the surface, and fine was what they all agreed to live with. The overdose was never mentioned. It was sealed. It became one of those family secrets that exists not in a box somewhere but in the quality of the air in a room when certain subjects come close to it, in the tension that develops in certain conversations and the way those conversations get redirected before they can arrive at the sealed place. And here is what I need you to understand about that secret, in the context of everything I have told you. My mother's need to protect Nate after the overdose became structurally different. It was no longer just the anxiety of a mother whose child had a heart murmur. It was the specific, terrifying, and completely unaddressed anxiety of a mother who knew her son had been that close to being gone, and who had never processed that knowledge in any genuine way, who had simply absorbed it and packed it somewhere internal and gone on with the project of daily life. And when Nate made bad choices, when he drank too much, when businesses failed, when relationships ended, her need to redistribute the consequences, to keep the full weight of those choices from landing on him, was not just favoritism and it was not just anxiety. It was something closer to terror. A terror she couldn't name because naming it would mean going back to the sealed place, would mean opening the night they'd driven home from the hospital and never talked about. So she kept not talking about it. And she kept redistributing. And she kept saying should have known better to the one person in the family who didn't know the thing that would have explained it all. I am going to tell you something about the night I found out the truth, which is the October Sunday, which is the thing this whole story has been leading to, and I want to get there properly with the full weight of what came before it behind it. The month before that Sunday, Nate had called me. Not a text, a call. A real phone call, which was unusual enough in our relationship that when I saw his name on my screen I had a brief, disorienting moment of not knowing how to hold the phone. I answered and his voice was different. Not bad different, not crisis different. More like someone who has made a decision and is calling in the aftermath of making it, with the particular quality of voice that people have when they've stopped performing. He said, *, hey, are you busy? *. I said no. He said, *, I'm in treatment. I've been in treatment for 6 weeks. I wanted to tell you. *. I sat down. I was standing in my kitchen when he called and I sat down on the kitchen floor, which apparently is what I do when the ground shifts. I go closer to the ground and I sat there and I said, *, okay. Tell me. *. He told me. Pieces of it, enough for me to understand the shape. He had entered a 30-day inpatient program in September, after a night that he described only as the night I finally understood I couldn't do this by myself anymore. He was now in an outpatient program, living with a friend who was sober, going to meetings. He said, working on things he hadn't worked on in a long time. I said, *, are you okay? *. He said, *, I'm getting there. I'm in the middle of the getting there part. *. I said, *, do mom and dad know? *. A pause. He said, *, dad knows. I called him when I went in. Mom is having a hard time with it. *. I thought about what it meant that my father had known for 6 weeks and had not said anything to me. I filed it. I said, *, what do you need from me? *. And Nate was quiet for a moment, a quiet that felt like someone doing something difficult, and then he said, *, I need to talk to you and mom at the same time. I've been working with my counselor on it. There are things I need to say that I should have said a long time ago. *. I said okay. He said, * Sunday. Mom's house. I'll bring it up. *. I said okay again. And I spent that month, the month between his call and that Sunday, living with what I didn't know yet but could feel approaching. I called Delia and told her, and she was exactly who she always is, warm and furious and certain that whatever was coming, I would be okay. I talked to Dr. Petrov, who said in her particular, still way, *, you're about to have a conversation that has been a long time coming. Try to go in without predictions about what it will contain. *. I tried. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday in October. It was the specific October weather that I love about Ohio, that particular cold brightness, the light at a lower angle, the smell of leaves and something cooling in the air, the whole world doing its annual turning inward. I parked in the driveway behind my father's car. The lights were on in the kitchen. I sat in my car for a minute. Then I went in. My parents were at the kitchen table. Howard stood when I came in, the way he always stood when I came in, and hugged me in his quiet, encompassing way. My mother was drinking tea, and she looked up at me with the careful expression she had worn more often in recent years, the one that acknowledged something was hard without naming what it was. Nate arrived 20 minutes later. He let himself in. He still had a key, had always had a key, which I noticed for the first time with a kind of wry internal recognition, and he came into the kitchen looking different from the last time I'd seen him. Not physically transformed, just more present in his own face. Less performing. He sat down at the table. I sat across from him. My parents were at each end, Howard to my left, my mother to my right, Nate directly across from me. The kitchen smelled like the coffee cake my mother had made. A recipe she'd been making my whole life. The smell of which is woven so deeply into my sense of home that I can't separate it from the feeling. Nate said, "Asterisk, I want to talk about some things." Asterisk. My mother said, "Nate, you don't have to." And Nate said, calmly and firmly, in a way I had never heard him use with her, the way someone sounds when they have practiced saying something until it becomes possible. Asterisk, Mom. I do. I need to. Please. Asterisk. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her tea. Then she nodded. Nate looked at me. He held my eyes for a moment, and the thing in his face was not quite an apology and not quite a request, and was both of those things simultaneously. Then he looked at the table, and then he started talking. He talked for 45 minutes. I have been trying to reconstruct it precisely in the 4 months since, and this is the version I keep arriving at. It was not one speech, it was more like layers, like a person taking apart something they had assembled wrong and showing you the pieces in the order they came apart. He started with the overdose. He said, "Asterisk, when I was 17 I ended up in the hospital. I don't know if Vera knows about this." Asterisk, he looked at me. I shook my head slowly. He said, "Asterisk, I didn't think so. I've been thinking about why that matters, and I think it matters because everything that happened after it happened in the shadow of it, and Vera was kept out of that shadow, which means she was operating without information that everyone else had. And that wasn't fair to her." Asterisk. My mother made a sound. Not words, just a sound, a small caught sound. The sound of something that has been closed for a long time being opened. Howard put his hands on the table and looked at them. Nate said, "Asterisk, I'm not saying the secret was kept with bad intentions. I understand why it was kept. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I understand that you were both scared and that you didn't know how to talk about it, and that not talking about it felt like the safest thing. But the not talking about it shaped everything that came after, including how you treated Vera when I made bad choices." Asterisk. My mother said, "Nate." He said, "Asterisk, I'm going to finish, Mom. I need to." Asterisk. And she closed her mouth. He said, "Asterisk, I have spent the last 30 years benefiting from a dynamic in this family that I didn't create, but that I used. Every time I made a choice that had consequences, and those consequences ended up landing on Vera instead of on me. Every time she got blamed for something I did, every time she got asked why she didn't stop me or why she didn't say something or why she wasn't watching, I let it happen. I didn't correct it. I didn't say, 'That's not right, that's my fault, leave her out of it.' I let her carry it because it was easier for me, and because somewhere deep down, in a way I wasn't honest about with myself, I knew how the system worked and I used it." Asterisk. The kitchen was completely quiet. He looked at me. Directly at me. He said, "Asterisk, Vera, I am sorry. I am specifically and directly sorry to you. Not in a general family therapy kind of way. In the real way. In the way where I am telling you that I saw what was happening and I chose the easier thing. And the easier thing for me was a harder thing for you for 15 years, and I knew it, and I'm sorry." Asterisk. I looked at my brother across my mother's kitchen table. I looked at him, 32 years old, 7 weeks out of treatment, hands flat on the table, face open in a way I had not seen since we were children. And I felt something happen in my chest that I cannot entirely describe, a kind of pressure releasing, a wall that had been holding something back no longer needing to hold it. I did not cry yet. I just looked at him. Then my mother made a sound. It was not a normal sound. It was the sound of a person who has been carrying something at great internal cost for a long time and has just heard someone name it out loud, which is the sound a human being makes when the thing they've been managing privately becomes public, which is somewhere between relief and grief and raw and nothing I had a word for. She said, asterisk, I knew. Asterisk. She wasn't looking at Nate. She wasn't looking at Howard. She was looking at me. She said, asterisk, I knew it wasn't fair. I knew it every time. I watched myself do it and I couldn't stop, and I told myself I was protecting him and that you were strong enough to take it, and She stopped. Her hands, which had been around her tea mug, came apart, and she pressed them flat on the table the way Nate had pressed his, and she looked at me and she said, asterisk, I knew it wasn't fair and I did it anyway. For 15 years. I did it anyway. Asterisk. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the October wind outside. My mother said, asterisk, Vera. I am so sorry. Asterisk. For words. For ordinary words in a sequence any English speaker can produce. My mother had been producing English for 62 years, had taught the written version of it to 9-year-olds for 30 of those years, had arranged it into sentences and paragraphs and the dense, capable structures of a woman who understood language. She had never, in 34 years of my life, arranged it in that particular sequence and directed it at me. I am so sorry. I did not have a plan for what to do when those words arrived. I had spent years managing the expectation that they never would, had built a relationship with their absence, had learned to carry the weight of them not being said the way you carry any long-term absence, by organizing yourself around the space it leaves. I was not prepared for their presence. What I did was start to cry. Not in a controlled way. Not in the way I cry in therapy, which is the quiet, managed kind, the kind that knows it is being witnessed by a professional and conducts itself accordingly. I cried in the way I cried on my bathroom floor, the private kind, the kind that comes from a place below performance, and then I stopped trying to manage it and let it happen because it was happening whether I managed it or not, because my mother had just said the thing I had spent 34 years not hearing and my body had decided that was worth some tears. Howard got up from his seat and came and stood near me and put his hand on my shoulder, and his hand was warm and there, and he said nothing, which was right, because there was nothing for him to say and he knew it. Nate was watching me. His own eyes were bright. He was holding himself together with the specific effort of someone who has learned recently that their emotions are useful information rather than things to be suppressed. My mother was still looking at me. She said, asterisk, I was so afraid of losing him. After he was born and they found the murmur, I was afraid every day. And then when he was 17 and they called me that night from the hospital, asterisk, she stopped, took a breath. Asterisk, it broke something in me. It broke my judgment about him. I stopped being able to let him experience the full weight of anything because the full weight of anything felt like it might be the thing that. She stopped again. Asterisk, I used you. I used your capability and your strength and your being older to manage my own terror about what might happen to him, and that was wrong, and I cannot tell you how sorry I am. Asterisk. I was still crying. I said, asterisk, I know. Asterisk. She said, asterisk, I don't think you do actually. I don't think I know is where we get to stop. Asterisk. And that was not what I expected her to say. I expected the apology and then the retreating, the smoothing over, the way that hard conversations in my family had always been interrupted by a need to return to the surface. What I did not expect was for my mother to stay in it, to refuse the easier exit, to look at me and say this has to be more than 4 words. She said, asterisk, I want to talk about it. All of it. Not today, maybe not this week, but I want to actually talk about it. With you. I don't want to go back to the way things were. Asterisk. I looked at her. 62 years old. The woman who had raised me. The woman who had made the coffee cake that made the kitchen smell the way it smelled. The woman who had spent 25 years telling me I should have known better. Who had spent 15 years distributing my brother's consequences onto the person who was supposed to be strong enough to carry them. Who had kept a secret that explained everything and had never trusted me enough to tell it. The woman who was right now looking at me like she had finally decided to see me. I said, asterisk, okay. Asterisk. Just that. Okay. Because it was the truest thing I could say, the one that left space for what might come next, the one that didn't close anything off and didn't pretend we were further along than we were. She said, asterisk, okay. Asterisk. I said, asterisk, it's not forgiveness yet. I want to be clear about that. But I'm not walking away. I'm here, Mom. I'm still here. Asterisk. And she looked at me for a long moment, and then she did something I had not seen my mother do in as long as I could remember. She put her face in her hands and cried. My mother cried at funerals. She cried at the end of books she loved. She cried at graduations and at certain songs on the radio. But she did not cry in front of her children about things that were her fault. She did not cry in ways that admitted damage. She was a woman who managed her emotional life with precision, who took out feelings and looked at them in private, and put them away before anyone else arrived. Watching her cry in my father's kitchen, with her face in her hands and no performance in it at all, was one of the stranger experiences of my life. Not bad strange, just disorienting, the way it's disorienting when the organizing facts of a situation change and you are inside the situation while the change is happening, trying to recalibrate in real time. I reached across the table and put my hand on her hand. I don't know why I did it. I did not make a decision to do it. My hand just went there, the way hands go to the places that need them when we are not thinking carefully enough to stop them. She felt it and looked up, in her face, with the crying on it, was someone I had not met before. Not the composed, managed classroom and kitchen table face I had known my whole life. Someone older and more tired and more honest. She turned her hand over and held mine. Nate watched us from across the table. He was not crying, but there was something in his face that was doing the thing that happens when a person has been carrying a decision for a long time and has finally made it and is in the still moment after, not triumph and not relief, but something in between, something that is its own kind of quiet. Howard had returned to his seat. He was holding his coffee mug with both hands. He said very quietly, asterisk, I should have said something. Over the years, I knew it was wrong and I should have said something. Asterisk. I looked at my father. He was not asking for anything. He was just saying it, in the plain, direct way that men like Howard sometimes finally speak when the room has become honest enough that not speaking would be its own form of lie. I said, asterisk, I know, Dad. Asterisk. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. We sat there for a while, the four of us, in the kitchen that smelled like coffee cake, in the October light coming through the window above the sink, in the specific silence that belongs to a family that has just finally said something true, and is now living in the first moments of the world that exists after it. It was not a perfect moment. I want to be clear about that, because I think the instinct when telling stories like this is to make the resolution clean and complete, to give the apology the weight of an ending, to say, and then everything was healed. And that would be a lie, and I have had enough of lies by omission, by my own family and by the stories people tell about their families, to not participate in one now. The apology was real. That was real. My mother's tears were real. Nate's words were real. The hand on mine was real. None of that was performance, and none of it was going to be taken back. But we are a family with 34 years of a particular operating system behind us, and operating systems do not change in a Sunday afternoon. My mother and I have had 3 conversations since that Sunday. Real ones, difficult ones, the kind that leave both parties wrung out and uncertain and oddly lighter. She has said sorry more than once. She has also, in one of those conversations, started to go back to an old pattern and caught herself mid-sentence and stopped and said, asterisk, I'm doing the thing. I'm doing it right now. Give me a second. Asterisk, and then started again in a different direction, which is the specific awkward miracle of watching someone actually try to change. It is not graceful. It is not smooth. It is a person stumbling towards something better, and that stumbling is the most honest thing she has ever shown me. Nate is doing the work. I don't say that lightly, because I have watched enough people say they are doing the work while actually just doing the performance of the work to know the difference. He is in ongoing outpatient care. He calls me once a week now, real calls, the kind where we talk about things that matter, and I am learning who my brother actually is underneath the person I had been maintaining distance from for 15 years, and the person I am finding is someone I think I am going to like. He is funny in a way that doesn't need an audience. He is more thoughtful than I expected. He has a dog now, a medium-sized brown dog named Fig, who I have met twice and who has already taken up permanent residence in my affection. My father called me the week after that Sunday. He said, asterisk, I've been thinking about what I should have said over the years, and there's no version of that conversation where I come out looking good, but I want you to know that I saw it. I saw what was happening and I should have stepped in and I didn't. And I'm sorry for that specifically. Asterisk, it was the longest speech Howard had made to me in 34 years. I cried after I hung up, the quiet kind. Delia, when I told her, said, asterisk, Vera, I need you to hear something. You kept showing up. For 34 years of a system that was hurting you, you kept showing up, and you did not become a person who stopped caring. Do you understand how difficult that is? Do you understand what that says about who you actually are? Asterisk. I said, asterisk. I think I kept showing up because I didn't believe the other option was available. Asterisk. She said, asterisk, maybe, but you also kept showing up because you love them. And that love was never the problem. It was always the most real thing in the room. Asterisk. I have been thinking about that since she said it. About the love that was always in the room. Even in the years when the room was full of blame and redistribution and sealed secrets and everyone looking at the table. The love was always in there. Distorted, expressed badly, working against itself in the specific ways that love works against itself when it is not examined, when it is attached to fear, when it is used to protect some people at the expense of others. But there. My mother loved me. She loved me in a way that was shaped by her own wound, by the terror of the heart murmur and the hospital call and the secret she carried, in a way that bent toward Nate when it should have been distributed more evenly, in a way that asked me to be stronger than I had any right to be required to be. She loved me badly for a long time in a way that hurt. That is the truth. And she is trying to love me better. That is also the truth, and it is new, and it is worth saying. I think about the lamp sometimes. The cream-colored floor lamp in the living room that I knocked over at 7 years old, and my mother in the kitchen doorway, and Nate on the couch watching cartoons, and the sentence that established the grammar of our family dynamic, you should have known better. 7 years old and already supposed to know better. I think about what it would have meant if my mother had walked into that room and said instead, asterisk, these things happen. Go get the broom. Asterisk, if she had given me the dignity of an accident instead of making me the guardian of a jurisdiction I hadn't agreed to hold. I think about the 7-year-old that I was, and I feel for her in the way you feel for a younger version of yourself when you finally understand what she was navigating without a map. She did her best, that 7-year-old. She did her considerable best with what she had, which was